Our first person that I would like to introduce today is the chair of the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission, Bob Ball, recently appointed by Governor Brown. You may know that he's one of Portland's leading developers and has been very successful in real estate investing and development and management. Also, probably more near and dear to many of our hearts, he serves as a reserve police officer for the Portland Police Bureau, where he holds the rank of commander. He's also been awarded the Police Medal of Valor and 2 Distinguished Service Awards from the Oregon Peace Officers Association. Please welcome Commissioner Ball.
Good morning, everyone. I really want to welcome you. This is a fantastic turnout we had today. I think we initially expected maybe 500 people to come, and we ended up having over 1,000. That was a fantastic turnout. On behalf of my fellow commissioners, I want to thank Mike Schmidt, the Executive Director of the Criminal Justice Commission, and the hardworking staff at the agency. They are absolutely amazing and did a fantastic job of putting this together. When the governor first asked me to chair the Criminal Justice Commission, I'd heard about the commission and I'd heard the term lip-6. And the first thing I did is I went to the statute and I wanted to read about what the role of the Criminal Justice Commission is. And what I really saw is it's really just about teamwork. It's about law enforcement and the courts, probation and parole, everyone working together to be more productive, to serve our citizens, and to have success with both the offenders and the victims of crime and everybody in the entire system. And I realize it's about using our resources well and doing the best job that we can for the citizens of Oregon. I'm honored today to introduce someone that I've known 17 years. We met through a mutual friend who actually worked for me, worked at my front desk, who actually was involved in her first campaign for state representative. And there's a bit of famous lore in Oregon politics. She won that first race by 7 votes. And what a lot of people don't know is what it took to win that race. And I remember our friend telling me that our honored guest that I'm about to introduce every day went out and walked the district. She worked hard. She worked tirelessly. It was difficult. She came back sometimes at the end of the days, and she was so tired she just collapsed on the floor in exhaustion. And that's the same person I've known for the last 17 years. She's thoughtful. She's tough. She's provocative. She cares, and she's a great leader. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce the governor of the state of Oregon, Kate Brown.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Chair Ball, for that very kind and generous introduction. Just for the record, I'm still collapsing every night when I go home after a long day, so luckily I'm able to recoup after 8 hours of sleep. I am so absolutely delighted to see so many of you here today at the Justice Reinvestment Summit. I also want to thank the entire team at the Criminal Justice Commission for their incredibly hard work in organizing this event, which has grown to be the largest gathering of public safety stakeholders in the state of Oregon. Congratulations and good job, well done. And then I also learned, Chair Ball just said that over 1,000 people have registered for the summit. I think they cut off the attendees at 1,000, and I am just very encouraged by that and very amazed by that. I think it speaks to the great interest around the state in justice reinvestment, both to its past successes and what we hope will be future successes as well. Since 2013, Oregon has recognized that investments in local communities can reduce the number of people going to prison. Some of the conversations have been tough, really, really tough. And I know that everyone in this room has taken some risks, but the hard work is definitely paying off. Oregon communities are safer today compared to the past decade. While we committed to an innovative approach to justice reinvestment, we continue to be challenged by the disproportionate disparities communities of color face throughout the entire state of Oregon. And in fact, Oregon has the 7th highest rate of African Americans incarcerated in state prisons in the country. Nationally, we know disparities within our criminal justice system all too commonly fall along racial and socioeconomic lines. This is absolutely unacceptable. There are a package of bills to address these disparities in front of the legislature this session, and it is my hope and it is my expectation that the legislature will act quickly on them. Addressing these disparities and improving our criminal justice system should not be political issues. Here in Oregon, and today in this room, we are demonstrating that reducing recidivism and improving the safety of our communities are efforts that all Oregonians can support. Despite the fact that we are facing a budget shortfall, a $1.7 billion budget shortfall, my recommended budget includes funding justice reinvestment because I recognize how critical it is to our entire public safety system. It's not just about the system as a whole. It's about changing individual lives and empowering more Oregonians to be successful and self-sufficient. We all make mistakes, which present opportunities for us to learn and to grow. As governor, I want to make sure that our young people have the tools, education, and resources to put those lessons to good use and become gainfully employed and productive members of our communities, whether you live in Klamath Falls, whether you live in Astoria, or someplace in between. 22-year-old Blaine from Coos County exemplifies this vision. As a teen, Blaine started experimenting with drugs. He fell behind in school and eventually began committing petty crimes. Tragically, Blaine's father, a corrections officer in the local Coos County, committed suicide, which devastated the family and Blaine went spiraling even further down in his path of crime. It was clear to his probation officer that his behavior was being driven by an inability to cope with these major life events. Fortunately, Blaine was young enough that an intervention could really change his trajectory. He got a second chance, and then a third. And now, Blaine has found a job on a ranch tending to horses. He said he has found a deep calm and peace working with the animals and is working toward a career that will involve animal care. The services Blaine is now receiving are focused on improving his ability to cope with the tragic loss of his father and restoring his strained relationship with his mother. He is building a network of support and engaged positively with his community. It's stories like Blaine's that really drive home for me the importance of justice reinvestment. Yes, I think every one of us in this room can appreciate the savings on prison bed costs. But what it really comes down to is the lives we can change by looking at an offender and figuring out how to turn things around for him or for her. I am so very grateful to all the public safety stakeholders in the room today because I know that your presence indicates your commitment to this effort. Please keep fighting the good fight and know that I will do everything I can to make sure we are continuing to invest in you and in your clients and in making Oregon a better place for all of us. Thank you so much. Have a really great day today.
Thank you to Governor Brown for her time and her support of justice reinvestment. I'd now like to introduce the District Attorney for Multnomah County, Rod Underhill.
Well, good morning, everyone. What a great crowd, and here for a common purpose. I have the distinct honor of being the individual selected to introduce our keynote speaker, the Milwaukee, Wisconsin District Attorney John Chisholm. But before I talk more about John, I beg the indulgence of Mike Schmidt, the Executive Director of the Criminal Justice Commission, for a minute of time to talk about principles, a message, and frankly, an ask for help. So the principles and message. It is a critical time in our country. It is a critical time in our state and in our communities. Whether it's my wife Dana and I sitting down with our children and having conversations over the summer and into the fall as we watch the national conversation, whether it's asking my staff of 200 lawyers, victim advocates, and staff members to join me in the middle of November for a conversation about our principles and our message, whether it's meeting in a small community room with members of the Somali community as they talk about their fears and frustrations, or whether a couple of weeks ago it's standing before a crowd like this of about 1,000 people, friends at the Muslim Educational Trust, talking about principles, message, and ask for help moments after, or I should say days after, the travel ban was delivered to our country. Those principles, those messages, and later in a minute the ask for help, include a statement, a commitment by all of us to not accept and tolerate hate speech and conduct, to not accept or tolerate racism, sexism, homophobic or xenophobic conduct or behavior. It's a commitment personally, as communities, and as Oregonians as we move into the next step into our working lives and personal lives. The comments I made to each of those groups is, we're going to see that conduct, we're going to read about it, we're going to witness it, we're going to experience it in our public safety jobs and lives, but we're also going to see it in our daily lives, whether it's friends, neighbors, or frankly, most importantly, whether it's when it's strangers. When we see that conduct, the ask for help is to stand up and not stand down. Don't let it go by. Have the backs of your community members, your friends, and as I mentioned, more importantly, even strangers. They need it from us more than ever before. So that ask is a commitment by me, our community, as Oregonians, to join together as we move forward, show our visitors from Wisconsin and Seattle here later today, and others from around the country, the Oregon way. And that Oregon way is to not accept the conduct that I've talked about. Hate speech, racism, xenophobic behavior, homophobic, sexism, none of those. So let's all agree to stand up and not stand down as we move forward. Speaking of standing up, it is, as I mentioned, my proud moment to talk about someone who has stood up for communities, not just his own in Wisconsin, Mr. John Chisholm, as a district attorney in Wisconsin for now 3 terms, for several years. He started in that office back in 1994 and has progressed with his deep love for his community and his organization of district attorneys in Wisconsin. He has been a leader in many conversations about reform and adjustments. John and I want to bring, you can read in your speaker's bureau, you can read about John, but I want to bring it down and talk for a minute about the Oregon connection. John and I have been friends for years now. John and I met as we are board of director members with the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, one of the National Prosecuting Attorneys Association. John was chair at the time, and John and I developed a quick, I think, friendship, kinship, and common thinking in many areas. And so when I bring it home to Oregon, We'll all remember the time period when we were having conversations about House Bill 3194, justice reinvestment, and our adjustments in our local community and state about how to do work better while at the same time driving down prison usage, beds, and costs. Many times, John and I had conversations during that window of time, both during the pendency of that work and then after, as it related to my work in Multnomah County with many, many others here in this room as we implemented the Multnomah County Justice Reinvestment Program. And so it is with proud honor that I do say that we are truly blessed to have Mr. John Chisholm, a person who was ahead of the curve on this conversation, a leader in prosecution worlds and a leader in his community with respect to the principles that we here in Oregon cherish. So let's give a round of applause and a warm welcome to Mr. John Chisholm, Milwaukee District Attorney.
Well, thank you very, very much, Rod, and thanks to all of you, and particularly the organizers of the Justice Investment Summit. So the Gospels say that the prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown. I am saying that not self-referentially. I'm not referring to myself in that term. When I look at the agenda that's before you today, I am tremendously proud of you. I'm envious of you. And I say it because I don't know if you yourselves know how incredibly ahead of the curve you are as a community, as a state, in addressing these really, really important issues that confront not just your communities, but confront communities across this nation on a daily basis. And I think it's just important once in a while that you step back and hear from an outsider that you really are on the leading edge of something really important. So my experience that brings me here today is grounded in the history of our office, the history of our community. Starting back in 1994 when I joined the office, Milwaukee County had been experiencing, as many communities around the country were experiencing, the crack epidemic, right? So the approach we took at that time was essentially the classic no-tolerance approach. We developed greater and greater capacity to identify people committing crimes and to prosecute them and to convict them and to put them into our correctional system, to the point that even in 2000, we adopted truth in sentencing in the state of Wisconsin with almost unanimous support, both from Democrats and Republicans, which is interesting. The only dissent that we heard was from the University of Wisconsin Law School, Professor Walter Dickey, who had formerly been in charge of the Department of Corrections in Wisconsin, who said, I think it's a bad idea. Truth in sentencing will blow up our prison system, is what his prediction was, that it would result in not just more people being put in for longer, but the revocations would increase commensurately as well. And as it turned out, that's exactly what happened. So when I talk about that history, there's also a very practical history in Milwaukee itself, in my experience. So my predecessor, who I have tremendous love and respect for, which is not what you always hear from the person that replaces the prosecutor, but I certainly did. He was an innovator. He was elected in 1968. He started one of the first victim advocacy units in the DA's office in the country at the time, committed to social justice. But he was also a strong believer because of the impact of, for example, crack in the city of Milwaukee. We had gone from about 70 homicides in the city of Milwaukee in 1989 to over 170 by 1990, just in the space of 1 year. And quite frankly, the system didn't know how to respond to that. And the approach that was taken was to try to deter the behavior through aggressive investigation, prosecution, and sentencing. So that's the environment that I grew up in, quite frankly. I was a felony drug prosecutor. I established a violent crimes task force in our office that worked with the U.S. Attorney's Office and others to target violent offenders, and I believe strongly in that model. Then in 2005, the office was approached by the Vera Institute. And the reason they chose the office is because my predecessor had been there for almost 38 years, and they thought that he was politically secure enough to be able to take on a very, very challenging issue, which is the request for the Vera Institute to actually come into the Milwaukee County DA's office and assess how we process cases, and to assess it specifically for the impact that we might have on racial disparity. And at that time, the national reports, Mark Maurer was coming out with the Sentencing Project reports that showed Wisconsin had the highest disparity, racial disparity in the country for African Americans. And by definition, that meant Milwaukee County. That meant the people coming from Milwaukee County were going there at a disparate rate, higher than anywhere else in the country. So that was coming out around 2006. Something else important happened right during that time frame, which is, again, is relevant to today's discussion, and that was a gentleman by the name of Frank Jude. Frank Jude was an African American who somehow ended up, he had a troubled past. He somehow or another ended up at an off-duty Milwaukee Police Department party, and during the course of that party, one of the officers' badges went missing. He became the focus of the attention, and he was brutally beaten by about 4 of those officers in the presence of about 15 or 20 other officers. And to say that became a flashpoint for the citizens in Milwaukee is an understatement. It had all the dynamics that you see in flashpoints around the country today. And that's a case we prosecuted, and we lost that prosecution. They were not convicted. Ultimately, the U.S. Attorney prosecuted the officers involved. Instead of just 4 of them being held accountable, about 12 of them ended up going to federal prison for civil rights violations. So there was great distrust in the community at the time. So those 2 things were happening almost at the exact same time. You had national reports coming out showing that Wisconsin had this disparity rate, and then on the other hand, you had the issue of community trust with the criminal justice system. That is the environment that I first ran for office in 2006. So the approach was one of 2 things. You could either put your shields up and say, thank you, but no, you just can't come into our office and take a look at how we're doing things because, quite frankly, we don't know what the results would be. Or the other approach was simply, now's a good time to do it. Now is an opportunity for us in our community to take a look at the issue and come up with one simple philosophy behind it, which is simply this, and that is, if there's a problem and we are responsible in any way for it, then we have an obligation to try to fix it. So Vera came in, they did their study, and so we were one of the first, and at that time, one of the only major cities to actually allow an outside entity to come in and evaluate what we did. And what did they find? What they found is that, on the whole, we charge people pretty even-handedly. Not surprisingly, they found that in certain areas there was massive disparity. And where was that disparity located? It was primarily in the drug offenses, it was in the public order offenses, and it was in the lower-level offenses as a whole. We even found reverse disparity. In other words, we found circumstances where white offenders were actually being prosecuted at a higher rate, primarily for property crimes. And the insight we drew from that was not what you might think. It was simply that the insight we drew was that maybe we were devaluing the victims of property crimes in our central city, and they weren't getting the same attention they were out in the suburbs. So it was the start of a process that allowed us to start examining ourselves as part of a broader system. And let me digress just for a moment. And when I say talking about the system in even a historical sense, and that is that the district attorney's function in the United States is the least examined function of any government entity in our country. It is simply the least examined. If you were to Google right now the history or the function of the prosecutor in the United States, you're not going to come up with much. And that's remarkable when you think about it. We've got law enforcement in the room. Law enforcement, I've heard just amazing elevator speeches from police chiefs, including my own, starting with Sir Robert Peel and telling you about the whole history of the law enforcement function. and its evolution in the different periods it's gone through. Certainly, you talk to anybody that's gone to law school, they can talk about Marbury versus Madison as sort of a seminal moment in the formation of the judiciary. Department of Corrections, Jeremy Bentham. You get to talk about philosophers. When you're talking to prosecutors, there simply is no generalized understanding of the history of the prosecutor's function in the United States, and that's a critical loss. It's a missing piece that we fundamentally have to address, because the prosecutor, as it functions particularly elected prosecutors in the United States, have more discretionary authority than any other official in our government, and they operate in thousands of different jurisdictions around the country, and each one of those is a little bit different. So one of the great benefits I've had of working with people like Rod and working with your sheriff here, quite frankly, Jason Meyer, give a shout out to him. I had the real privilege. And again, I want you to know how lucky you are to have the people you are that are serving in a collaborative fashion with you. So after we found those disparities, we had to do something about it, right? And one of the things we established first and foremost was a Community Justice Council. And from that moment on, we invited the National Institute of Corrections in to educate us on evidence-based decision-making. Kind of on my own, I just started diverting people out. We approached it from a tiered approach where we just outright diverted people if they were lower risk. The medium risk, we started doing deferred prosecutions on. And then for the clinically addicted, high-risk offenders, for the first time in 2009, if you think about that, again, put it in context, we didn't have a drug treatment court until 2009 in Milwaukee County. Does it make a difference? Yeah, there's no question that it does. All the studies that have come are pretty remarkable when you graph them out. You can actually see that starting in 2006, there's a dramatic reduction in individuals, particularly African Americans, from Milwaukee County going to the state prison system. Is there an impact on racial disparity? Yes. The most recent studies that have come out of the University of Wisconsin have shown that of the 4 major concentrated populations of African Americans in our state, or the 5, Milwaukee County now has the lowest disparity rate. But let me I'll caution one thing, and I was talking to Rod about this yesterday, and that is we still have high rates of disparity. So if I were to summarize it like this, if I was 750 out of 1,000 people from Milwaukee were African American, if I can reduce that now to 75 and 100, I'm making a difference. But that rate might not change as much as I want it to. And there's a lot of reasons that are impacted by that. So there's this narrative of progress. There's no question that there is a narrative of progress as we've engaged in this. But I will also tell you that the challenges are immense. We are all now, fortunately, familiar with the work that's been done on mass incarceration. So if you keep in mind that graph, starting in 1972, you see the incarceration rate going off the charts. And what you also see is that the violent crime rates, essentially, they go up, they go down, they go up, and they go down. But they're not really impacted by that enormous upward curve in incarceration. What's less inspected and reviewed, I believe, and equally important, is in the mid-1960s, you also had a significant decarceration taking place for the mentally ill. And by that, obviously, those were terrible places. You did not want your citizens in those locations. But the problem is that you were releasing people from institutions back into the community with absolutely no resources or support. And as a consequence, that upward curve in your prison system was now being populated to a significant extent by the mentally ill. And so that has been our challenge that we face each and every day. We just recently received a grant from the MacArthur Foundation to address specifically that issue. My aspiration on that is very simple, and that is to keep the mentally ill out of our jails and out of our prisons completely. My aspiration is that we develop a completely different relationship with our community and with our partners, and that's, again, why I'm so amazed and excited by what I see here today. Wisconsin does not have a justice reinvestment initiative framework. It doesn't have it. Marshall is here in the crowd. He was in Wisconsin in 2008, 2009, It was a Democratic governor, a Democratic legislature, and after all the hard work we did and kind of bipartisan consensus on it, it was rejected. It was rejected. So the work that I'm talking about, I have done completely on my own. This is something that out of that experience, I said simply that it can't simply be about saving money at the end of the day. Our fundamental obligation is to serve the citizens of our community, to keep them safe, but to do so in a way that actually respects their dignity, respects their civil rights, and that requires a different framing up and a different function. I believe, just as Rod said, I think that this is one of those critical moments. So Jeremy Travis, recently retired president of John Jay University, he will describe this as sort of an essential epic in criminal justice history. Going back, he says there hasn't been a moment in time like this since the 1966-68 time frame where the Presidential Commission on Crime report came out, and that actually set the framework that we have operated under for the last 40 years, sort of the industrial fishing model, as you were. Cops catch them, prosecutors cook them, the courts eat them, and then the Department of Corrections will hold on to them for a period of time before expelling them back into the community. And that is the model that has been followed far too long and has resulted in a circumstance now that we recognize as a country isn't sustainable, and more importantly, it's just not right. So what can we take? What can we take out of this? And what I encourage you doing, we're doing it with the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, where you're seeing this framework reinforced across the spectrum of criminal justice reform, and that comes out of that National Academy's report on mass incarceration. And what are the 4 principles that we should all aspire to? And they are normative values. That means prosecutors, police, that means judges, that means the defense bar, that means social services, pretrial services, corrections. All of us can frame our collaborations together on 4 basic principles. And what are they? First and foremost, it's parsimony. That means that we use state power when we have to use state power, but only to the limited extent that it's absolutely necessary. And what's the second one? It's proportionality. That means that our response has to be proportional to the problem itself. We can't over-respond to every single problem and rely simply on the criminal justice system to do so. The third one is citizenship, and it's, I know in the context of the national discussion right now, I'm not intending to exclude those who are not full citizens, but it's the concept itself. It's about how we treat individuals that come into our system. Do we treat them like full citizens, or do we treat them like something less than full citizens after we've arrested them and put them in an orange jumpsuit and crammed them into a jail cell with lots of other people? That is a message that we're sending to those individuals that they are no longer full citizens. And then we expect when they come back after having those experiences that they reintegrate fully into our community. That's something that we have to change, and prosecutors need to play a role in that. I have a full community prosecution program that places my experienced prosecutors right out in the community to help solve problems from the community, to change that relationship so that we're not identified as simply the law and order model of prosecutor, but we're actually identified as people that you can go to try to solve problems before they spin out of control. And what's the final one? And that's social justice, and that's what we all have to be engaged in. It is not a dirty term. Social justice simply means that relationship that we in the system have with the people we serve. And I fundamentally believe that we have to reestablish a relationship that's based on respect, that's based on trust, and that is allowing us to move forward in the future in a way that solves these problems in a way that's effective, it's safe, but it also just respects the fundamental dignity of the people we serve. So again, I'm just tremendously honored to be here with you. I'm excited by what I'm seeing. And again, I'll finish by saying I'm envious. You are far ahead of the curve, and I ask you to just remember that when you're working with one another, because the first rule we learned in law school was that trashing is fun, right? You get in a room and you start tearing the other side down and working on them. This is going to require a fundamental change in the way we work with one another. That means prosecutors are going to have to cede more of their control than they have in the past. Judges are going to have to approach things in a different way. Corrections across the whole spectrum, the defense bar is going to face many challenges in this process as well. But I'm also convinced that if we approach this with the people we serve, who have oftentimes come from incredibly challenged environments of concentrated disadvantage, poverty, violence, environmental conditions, healthcare, all of those things eventually end up in our lap. And we have to pull together and make sure that we're conveying to the rest of our community that what we're doing is the right thing and it's being done the right way. So bless you all for what you're doing. It's a privilege, it's an honor to be here today, and I look forward to talking with many of you. Thanks.
He's tall. So just sort of a note on how we're moving along. We will be taking a break at 10:15, so we have one more session before the break, but if you need to quickly stand up to get some blood flowing or stretch out a little, I'm okay with that. If you need to take a deep breath. Okay, everyone is doing great then. I see a lot of people put their phones away. I'm very impressed. Over the past 20 years, Oregon's female prison population has tripled, as we all know. We are on the verge of needing a second women's facility, despite programs such as Family Sentencing Alternative. This makes Dr. Emily Salisbury's next presentation particularly timely for us. We have not seen the same impact on the female population as we have the male population through justice reinvestment. Dr. Salisbury is an associate professor of criminal justice at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and editor-in-chief of the academic research journal Criminal Justice and Behavior, and is the co-author of the book Correctional Counseling and Rehabilitation. Her primary research areas include correctional policy, assessment and treatment intervention strategies with a focus on justice-involved women and gender-responsive policy. This presentation will focus on understanding the unique risks and needs of justice-involved women and why we really need to embrace a gender-specific approach as this rise in the female jail and prison population continues. With that, please welcome Dr. Salisbury.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real honor for me to be here today. It's fun for me to be back in Oregon. Some of you may be aware I was a professor at Portland State University for 7 years, and had a lot of fun serving some time and working in Portland. So it's really a pleasure to be back, although I have to say leaving the 70 degrees and the sunshine in Las Vegas was tough because I knew what I was coming to in February in Portland and in Salem and in Oregon. So I, again, just want to really thank you for being here today and thank John Chisholm as well for his comments. Certainly very important things that we need to be considering around the prosecutorial function, and I'm very pleased that you spoke to that issue, so thank you. So one of the first things before I get started is I want to acknowledge some of the people that really helped organize this event and really highlight the fact that Tiffany Quintero and Julie Vaughn worked really hard to make this happen. I want to thank the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission. If we could give them a round of applause for working hard. And as many of you know, I'm here to talk to you about not forgetting about the ladies and putting ladies first and remembering that we've had a massive increase in the number of women who are incarcerated in terms of the global, not just the increase in incarceration nationally, but also globally. And so there has been a 700% increase in the number of women incarcerated in the U.S. And even though many more men are in prison than women, the rate of growth for female imprisonment has outpaced men by more than 50% between 1980 and 2014. What should not escape you about this is that half of those women are incarcerated in jails. And an important piece to keep in mind, and I want to remind folks of a report that came out recently by the Vera Institute that mentioned that this growth in the number of women in jails is obviously finally getting some attention. And it highlights the fact that in 1970, 3/4 of all counties in the U.S. had absolutely 0 women in their jails. Not one. Since 1970, the number of women in jail nationwide has increased 14-fold. and now accounts for, again, approximately half of all women behind bars in the United States. Just like in prisons, unfortunately, women of color are disproportionately represented in jails and are primarily there, of course, for drug and property crime offenses, even though they don't disproportionately commit more of those crimes anymore than white folks. And recent studies also show that a sizable proportion of women are in jail for technical violations rather than for committing new crimes. Interestingly, a separate report by Vera indicated that much of the increase in jail populations in the last several decades has been driven by rural counties, an important point to be considering. Getting an understanding of whether this is true also in Oregon is something that I would think maybe the Commission wants to look into in terms of whether or not the driving increase in incarceration and the female rate of incarceration is coming from a little bit more from the rural counties as well. Oregon, unfortunately, is not an exception to this rule in terms of the increase in the female incarceration rate. Between 1994 and 2015, according to the Criminal Justice Commission, the female prison population increased 200%. Of course, much of what is driving this is the fact that an increase in women's populations in prison are not the result of women becoming more violent or becoming more problematic, but the fact that our sentencing laws have changed and our policies around certainly the war on drugs has also been a war on women and a war on particularly women of color. So we have to talk a little bit about the gendered impact, of course, of Measure 57. And although Measure 57 isn't the only driver of increased incarceration rates for women, it is going to be a factor, of course, because it enhanced the penalties for crimes that are more frequently committed by women. I can still recall back in 2008 sitting in my office at Portland State University as a newly minted professor thinking and wondering why nobody, it seemed, was really talking about the fact that the combination between the forced choice between Measure 61 and 57 inherently was going to cause an increase in the number of women going to prisons in this state. So I feel like if I had had a little bit more of my academic voice at the time and wasn't too newly minted, I maybe would have been screaming a little bit louder from my office. So I also want to remind folks as well, in thinking about putting on your gendered lens here for a moment during my talk, is that if we take a step back to consider how penalties and sentencing is created, it's important to remember that sentencing strategies, like everything else in our criminal justice system, are based on men's offense dynamics. The National Institute of Corrections and the National Association of Women Judges highlight this in their training curriculum for judges when sentencing women offenders. When the penalty for a generic crime is based principally on the factual scenarios involved in the commission of that crime by men, which vary significantly from the scenarios of that crime committed by women, then the sentence itself is male-normed. In other words, when criminal penalties are based on the offense dynamics of men and applied to women offenders as if their dynamics are exactly the same, which in many cases they aren't, then the penalties and the sentences themselves are inherently biased against women. Offense dynamics, of course, do vary considerably across gender. Women are far less likely to engage in violence, less likely to use a gun or a weapon in the commission of an offense, far less likely to be the kingpin or ringmaster in criminal enterprises. This, of course, doesn't mean that women shouldn't be punished or held accountable. Of course, that's not what anybody's saying. It's certainly not what I'm saying either. But it should be recognized that they are far less dangerous, pose less of a risk to public safety, and that the social and fiscal costs of their incarceration have wider implications and effects on families and their children. Of course, before they were women in the system, they were also girls. There were girls, many of them were girls in the juvenile justice system. Some of you may be aware of the Crittenden Foundation. This is an infographic that was taken from a report written by Francine Sherman and Annie Balk. And I just want to review a few important points from this graphic. 45% of the girls in the juvenile justice system had 5 or more adverse childhood experiences. For those of you that are aware of the ACEs research, girls actually experience more ACEs or adverse childhood events than boys. And these different kinds of ACEs also have differential effects on their sequelae and their behavior. 31% report experience of sexual abuse, but what I will say is other research also indicates that some estimates are as high as 70% of justice-involved girls are reporting sexual abuse. That may be an underestimated figure here. 41% experience physical abuse, 39% experience emotional abuse, 84% experience family violence. We can't really talk about girls and women in our system without talking about the unfortunate, tremendous tragedies of trauma and victimization that these women have experienced. If you've worked with women, you understand this idea, and you understand how this plays out in very different ways for justice-involved women. Next, of course, many of these problems, unfortunately, that we find with girls in their childhood and early childhood development manifest for very different pathways to crime. So one of the things that I'm sort of known for is this research that I've done on women's pathways to incarceration and women's pathways to recidivism. What we have found over and over again is that the stories that women have told us time and time again about the narratives of how they got in the system themselves is that they oftentimes tell us, my life started off as pretty rough childhood. Things didn't really go well. I had somebody who was putting his hands on me. This led to me, really starting to numb out with substance abuse, to numb out the chronic physical and emotional pain of that abuse. After 50 years of qualitative data, of interviewing the life history, narratives and hearing the voices of women, it turns out that these narratives actually bear out quantitatively. They're supported by quantitative research. So one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that that pathway is not just a pathway, certainly women tell us, but also it's borne out in the data as well. So one of the research studies that I just mentioned was done with 313 female probationers from the state of Missouri, and I actually tested these common pathways that you oftentimes hear about childhood victimization, being in unhealthy relationships, having lower levels of social and human capital, meaning more and more economically marginalized and socially marginalized. Those pathways actually led to many of those women who were pretty low risk to continue to cycle through the system and continue to fail on probation, and failing for pretty basic reasons. It's one thing to give a woman a job, it's one thing to target her attitudes and to target some of her criminogenic needs, but if you're not talking about and targeting some of the core things that are going on with that woman, including understanding how these pathways look very different, then we'll continue to see the same sorts of cycling through the system with these justice-involved women. And so, because we have a whole host of research studies now, 50 years of data, of qualitative data, and lots of other data that I'll mention shortly, we now have come to a point where we're advocating for something called gender-responsive strategies. And many of you in the room have heard me talk about this, and you've been trained on gender-responsive strategies about why we need to start having different conversations and different policies and practices and assessment tools specifically designed for justice-involved women. These strategies intentionally use research on gendered life experiences to direct policies, programs, and procedures for women. The goal, of course, is to produce outcomes that are favorable to them on their supervision and to really start with an understanding and a framework that gender just simply matters. If any of you have ever raised a daughter and a son, you know the difference. You understand the distinctions. If any of you have ever worked with justice-involved women and justice-involved men, you know there's distinctions. If any of you have suffered from gender identity, you understand these issues. And so it's important for us to keep considering and thinking about how gender really does affect the way that we behave, the way that we understand people, and how the biases exist in many ways if we're not thinking about women first. and how these things can really manifest differently. And so, for those of you that maybe still are confused about where gender-responsive strategies falls in terms of evidence-based practices, it's important for me to highlight the fact that gender-responsive practices is an empirically based, evidence-based practice. That just like in evidence-based practices, we're testing our research by methodologically rigorous studies. We're finding things to be effective at reducing justice-involved women's recidivism. But at the same time, we're also accounting for the differences in characteristics and life experiences of girls and women, and comparing those to boys and men in the justice system. So it's not as if this isn't evidence-based. And so I want to highlight the fact that evidence-based practices really does encompass and is part of gender-responsive strategies, that the two can co-occur at the same time. We can have both, and in fact, if we're working with women, we should be doing gender-responsive strategies because, of course, the evidence demonstrates that there are very unique and very different needs for this population. I'd also remind you that the Bangkok rules are a relatively newly formed mandate, and that we can think about justice-involved women and gender-responsive strategies from a human rights perspective, that international reform is happening as a result of all of the research that exists on gender-responsive strategies. So the United Nations adopted the Bangkok rules in 2010, which essentially outlines all of the things that are necessary in order to supervise and treat women successfully, both in prison and on community supervision. This is not an issue that's going away anytime soon. The evidence and the jury is out. Ladies are different. I may be skipping ahead there, sorry. Okay. And so if we can return back to, of course, Oregon and thinking about the issues that we really want to focus on today in Oregon, I want to give you kind of the backstory about why I probably was asked to come here today and to speak with you. Oregon recognizes the unique needs of women, the unique criminogenic needs. Back in 2015, Oregon DOC requested NIC assistance to implement what's called the Women's Risk Need Assessment Tool. It's an instrument that was specifically designed for justice-involved women, and one that I helped develop back at the University of Cincinnati when I was a PhD student. And I'm proud to say that the state has really started to has rolled out the WRNA. Many of you, I see your faces in the audience today, were trained by me, and then are now training other agencies and other counties on the Women's Risk Need Assessment, and so far I can say that things have gone, pretty well in terms of implementation. There's not been as much pushback as I think a lot of people had maybe anticipated, but and I think part of the reason is people who work with justice-involved women have been saying for many, many years, we need something different. Risk assessment tools that are gender neutral, while they may work to some extent, they don't work nearly as well. And so one pathway to understanding how to start thinking about our population and female population in Oregon differently is to understand how their risks and needs look very different, of course. Sorry, okay, thanks. And so I want to just give you some background about the WRNA and how it's being implemented across the United States. We're now in 22 different states. I've trained, it's not statewide in every single one of these states, but in various jurisdictions. It is statewide or in various different areas of the system. I've trained on the WRNA now in the Czech Republic, in Namibia. I'm headed to Singapore in May. Again, because of the Bangkok rules and the dissemination of the knowledge around this is stuff that's not going away. The WRNA has been validated in many, many different sites and many different studies, and I'd be happy to talk to you about the research and the psychometric research behind the WRNA. But I can tell you that it's a very well-validated tool, and validation will be occurring, of course, in the state of Oregon very soon as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how risk does really manifest differently and why women pose less risk. It's part of the reason why it's more of a challenge, actually, for me to do my research when I do research on justice-involved women, because, quite honestly, they have lower base rates. They're less likely to recidivate. And so we have to start thinking about the fact that women do pose far less risk and that they do need a different risk assessment tool. Additionally, we have to think about and consider the relative risk that an individual poses within her peer group. A lot of times women are compared in terms of their risk levels to men, and I understand why that happens. We want equity in sentencing and equity in justice. But important to think about from a researcher's perspective and from my perspective is that when we talk about risk assessment, we have to be thinking about them in relative terms and the subgroup and the group that we're comparing against. And so because women pose far less risk, we have to keep those things in mind. This doesn't mean that women pose no risk or don't have any risk and that they don't have need for services and interventions. Of course, that's not the case, but important to consider how their risk is relative to their population. Additionally, gender-neutral assessments appear to be less valid for women who follow those kinds of gendered pathways to crime that I was talking about earlier. Lots of researchers, in addition to myself, have started to see that, and it's another reason why we need to bolster and have those gender-responsive assessments in place. But with that said, I also want to mention this idea that I'm starting to call psychometric gymnastics. There's so much data out there now around the differences and unique needs of justice-involved women and how they pose less risk, is that I know that gender-neutral assessments are going to be using cut points and weights and algorithms and machine learning and all kinds of different ways to use the same assessment tool for men, but then just change it up and use some fancy psychometrics to make it work for women. Over and over and over again, I've heard about risk assessment tools working fine for women, but not nearly as well as for the male population. And that, to me, is a problem. If we know that there are other assessments and other ways of targeting women that are to the best of their ability, to the best of our abilities, if there's research that says we can do better, we should do better. And so if statistically predictive gender-responsive items are not included in an instrument in the first place, things like prior trauma, unsafe housing, depression and anxiety, PTSD, unhealthy relationships with intimate partners, then we'll never see true and accurate measures of women's criminogenic risk. And we owe it to not only the justice-involved women to understand their different and unique needs, we owe it to public safety as well. Okay. Some of you have heard me also say this before, too. For the POs in the room and people who work in corrections day to day, you know the big four. I know you know them inside and out, backwards and forwards. These are the major risk factors on the left that you see that we see are the most predictive of male offending behavior. I'm not prepared, and our research is actually starting to show that we need to be thinking about something different for women. Something that I'm calling the female 4. It may even be the female 5 if you add in anger, because there's a lot of angry women out there too from a lot of the trauma and abuse and victimization that they've experienced. And so while I can't say that all of these things up here have been rigorously studied to date, the patterns that I'm seeing in our data and from data from other researchers is that there are other things that we need to be focusing on, and I'm not prepared to say that antisocial attitudes are the primary driving factor of why women commit crimes. Women do have antisocial attitudes, things like, if you leave the keys in the car, if I don't steal the car, somebody will, right? Or blaming others, or blaming everybody else for their problems. Certainly many women do have those attitudes. But more often what I see and what I hear POs say to me and people who work with justice-involved women is they say things like, you know what, women have more self-defeating attitudes. When I hear the attitudes of women, it's about, I'm no good, I'm not good enough, I'm worthless. People have been telling me I'm worthless, so I must be. The lack of self-esteem and self-efficacy in these women manifests in many different ways. Unhealthy intimate relationships. Many women are involved in systems, in our criminal justice system, not to blame, the men in their lives or other intimate partners. Women need to take agency and have agency in their crimes and should be held accountable for them. But many women are engaged in unhealthy relationships that get them in trouble. And when I asked women in focus groups and criminal justice settings, especially in reentry, in prison settings, what are you worried about when you release from here? Over and over and over again, women would say, I'm worried that I'm going to get out of here and then I'm going to meet up with, John again, and things are just going to fall apart. If women are telling us that over and over and over again, turns out actually that's a criminogenic need that doesn't get a lot of attention, unfortunately, that should be getting attention. Emotional dysregulation, not having good emotional boundaries. Again, if you work with these women, you know some of these stories. With that said, I also just want to remind people, though, of an issue that maybe you saw recently in the Washington Post, particularly, around racial bias and big data being used, potentially perpetuating racial bias in our criminal justice system. Again, this is a story from just this last weekend by a doctoral student in political science at the University of California, Berkeley. And she mentions and makes a really important point that data from risk assessments are only as good as the information put in them. If there are biased police practices, whether implicit or explicit, those biases can make a risk prediction tool also biased. Although using data and machine learning can help remove human bias in the system, if the criminal history variables on an instrument reflect policing biased practices or prosecutorial misconducts or prosecutorial biases, then predictions of who might be higher and lower risk to reoffend will also be biased. Something to keep in mind as we continue to think about data. I'm a scientist. I love data, of course. I like working with data. I trust data. But important for us to think about the context of where data comes from. Okay. And so now I want to just kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about more specifically downsizing the prison population in Oregon, since really this is a critical issue in the state and certainly what justice reinvestment is really all about. This study comes from Dr. Jody Sunt, who used to be down in the office for me at Portland State University, but who is now an associate dean at IUPUI in Indianapolis. While she was in Oregon, she conducted a public opinion survey of Oregonians regarding their support for various criminal justice policies and priorities from across the state, specifically related to prison downsizing. Her study included geographic representation from across the state in both rural and urban areas and had a good cooperation rate. While the focus of this study isn't specifically on downsizing the women's population, it nevertheless gives us some context for how Oregonians feel generally about public safety. Okay. So first, Dr. Sunt found that Oregonians broadly support a preventative, rehabilitative approach to public safety rather than a punitive approach. When asked to share their opinion about what they thought should be the top priority for addressing crime, 2/3 of Oregonians supported a preventative rehabilitative approach to public safety. Second, to assess their correctional orientation, over half of respondents indicated that rehabilitation should be the main emphasis in prisons, compared to only 9% who supported emphasizing punishment. In addition, there's broad support in many ways for downsizing, but it's a complicated issue. The survey also asked a global question about whether respondents would support the idea to, quote, shrink the size of the prison population to reduce government spending. Interestingly, more than 2/3 of Oregonians rejected this idea. So it might have been expected that the public would also oppose specific policies to reduce the prison population, but this was not actually the case. In fact, the overwhelming majority, 96% of respondents, favored at least one option that would reduce the use of incarceration in Oregon. The least supported policy, which is not that surprising, is shortening prison sentences for certain crimes. Still, this option was favored by over 60% of Oregonians who were surveyed. The other specific downsizing policies were endorsed by a strong majority of the sample. In fact, 3/4 of those surveyed favored developing options to punish and treat offenders in the community, and 69% of participants favored an earned release for good behavior. So it appears that Oregonians favor specific policies to reduce the prison population, but not for the sole purpose of lowering government spending. It's quite an interesting finding to us policy wonks who really want to know more and think about why that is. And so if we consider downsizing the women's prison population in Oregon, we take it a bit further and think about what it will take to downsize at Coffee Creek. I've come up really with sort of 5 different recommendations here, and the good news story is that the first couple of these have started to roll out in promising ways throughout Oregon. So first of all, of course, continued quality assurance and validation of the Women's Risk Need Assessment tool. It's my understanding that validation study will be happening at some point soon, of course, in Oregon, and making sure that the quality assurance still is there in terms of the fidelity to the model and fidelity to the tool. For counties to use gender-specific and gender-responsive supervision strategies, especially among jails, probation, and parole. And so as we start to roll this out, it's important for counties to recognize that how you supervise and how you violate and how you treat justice-involved women actually looks different. Of course, I don't have time to go into all of the ins and outs of how those things look different and how you start to shift to that model, but those trainings and those ideas absolutely do work. And in counties where this isn't going on yet, we need to start thinking about doing that more. A wider investment in gender-responsive curricula. I'm editor of an academic journal, right, Criminal Justice and Behavior, and we have our first meta-analysis that actually demonstrates that gender-responsive curricula that target women offenders' needs in very holistic, trauma-informed ways actually increases the likelihood that we'll be more successful in reducing justice-involved women's recidivism in comparison to gender-neutral programs like straight-up MRT, moral recognition therapy, anger replacement training, and the brand name curriculums that I know many of you know in terms of CBT programs. Meta-analysis actually says we get more bang for our buck if we adopt gender-responsive curricula. I'm happy to say that Coffee Creek is now starting to mandate that from contractors who are working inside Coffee Creek, and they are also and have also moved into that direction as well. We need to start seeing more of that happening in counties across the state. As well, thinking about how these programs look in terms of working with not just justice-involved women, but women who are seeking the services of the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Health here, that the programs they put in place also should be thinking about putting programs in place that are also gender responsive. Educating judges and other key stakeholders about why this looks different and how this looks different. I recognize that we need to be doing more training around stakeholders, understanding about why this is so important and why this is so critical. And so I just want to honor the fact that if you are a judge, a prosecutor, somebody who hasn't heard this stuff before, I'd be happy to talk to you more about why this becomes so important. And then I want to mention also a careful analysis of the public safety checklist. It's my understanding that the PSC works and is, of course, valid for justice-involved women, and that people, of course, in the Commission have looked at the PSC to make sure that it does work, but I have some ideas about why some things may be not working as well in terms of using that public safety checklist, because many of those things, many of the items on the PSC, again, we started with men in mind and then applied things to women. And if gender is one of the variables, which is a good thing to have, obviously, to take into account gender on the PSC, there actually may be things happening that are backfiring with having gender as a variable in the PSC. And so I want to encourage a more detailed and careful analysis of how the PSC is operating specifically for justice-involved women. And so in closing, I just want to mention that contrary to what some people have said about justice-involved women needing a timeout in prison, I just simply don't agree. Women don't need a timeout, they need a way out. A way out of the insidious violence, insidious trauma, victimization, and discrimination, particularly women of color have experienced. And they don't get out without programs and interventions that are specific to their criminogenic needs and that build upon their strengths. I want to thank you for your time and your attention.
Okay, so a couple notes as we head into the breakout sessions. We have attempted to have something for everyone. So if you have multiple people here from your county, I suggest you divide and conquer so you can really get the most out of this. Everybody was so attentive during the morning presentations. I very much appreciate that. I am going to quickly share bullet points on each breakout session for you. Those will be held in the Salisbury rooms. Back in the old TV days, we would call this the tease or the promo. I will do it very quickly. Breakout 1 is focused on diverting persons experiencing mental illness away from the justice system and to wraparound services. You will hear from treatment providers, law enforcement, DAs, and community corrections about their experience and their promising practices in both rural and urban Oregon. Breakout 2 explores the prevalence of trauma for those involved in the justice system. Dr. Brian Meyer will be with us to give an overview of the impacts of trauma on the justice involved, as well as some practical suggestions for assisting traumatized people so they don't reoffend. Breakout 3 will discuss the emerging use of telehealth services and how they can be used in rural areas, particularly in a drug court setting. And Breakout 4, we will discuss Oregon's recent selection as the National Criminal Justice Reform Project site with a focus on pretrial reform. So a couple other notes. We will be taking a 15-minute break now. Lunch will be served around noon. We will all be back together in this room at 12:15. You'll have about a half an hour after the breakouts get out before we're going to be back in here to check your phones and eat and use the restroom, all that good stuff. Also, 2 other notes. Those who are headed to the Capitol on a pre-planned trip with Patrick from AOC, please head down to the registration table. You'll head over at 10:30. And finally, there are exhibitors downstairs, raffles, snacks, coffee. I encourage you to visit them as well. I will see you back here at 12:15. Enjoy the breakouts.